everyone. Welcome to the second in our Census Counts Campaign and Funders Census Initiative Census Operations Series webinar focused on census hiring. Thank you so much to everyone for joining the call today. We are delighted to be joined by an exceptional lineup of experts on the census and on census operations and census hiring. I do also want to mention that this is the second webinar in our Census Operations webinar series. The first webinar on self-response took place last month, and that recording and those slides are available online at censuscounts.org and at the Funders Census Initiative if folks have questions. Next month, we'll be continuing talking about enumeration of group quarters and transitory locations. Then we'll be continuing about tips for organizers, as well as how to monitor the count in real time. So look out for the information about the upcoming webinar series. Can you advance next slide? So like I mentioned, my name is Beth Link. I am the director of the Census Counts Campaign at the Leadership Conference Education Fund. The Census Counts Campaign is a collaborative effort of over 15 national partners and dozens of state partners in over 30 states. We have resources available at censuscounts.org and welcome folks to utilize those resources. At this point, it's my absolute pleasure to turn the call to my partner in this webinar series, Jocelyn Bissonette at the Funders Census Initiative. Jocelyn?
Thanks, Beth. I just want to say a quick introduction. Again, I'm Jocelyn Bissonette with the Funders Census Initiative. FCI is really proud to be able to partner on this series. We're a growing network of more than 300 funders and philanthropy-serving organizations, and are a place where those organizations can connect and access resources around the fair and accurate census. And just want to note that in addition to the staff here, we have a dedicated leadership team, and other important philanthropy partners include the Democracy Funders Census Subgroup, as well as the United Philanthropy Forum, who we're working with to support the mobilization of the philanthropic community. So welcome, and I'll turn it back over to Beth for some webinar logistics.
Great. Thanks, Jocelyn. So on the logistics side, a couple of things that I wanted to elevate for folks. Today's hosting organizations are 501c3 organizations, meaning that we do not support or oppose candidates running for public office. And so we're asking that all questions and comments be respectful of our nonpartisan status. This is a 60-minute call, and a recording will be made available at the end of this call. Participants joining the call will have an opportunity to ask questions, and we ask that you do so by putting those in the chat box, and we'll make an effort to answer as many questions as possible. We'll also share those instructions again once all the presentations are complete. At this point, it is my absolute pleasure to start to introduce our incredible speakers on this for this conversation. So I'm going to introduce three of those, and then Jocelyn will introduce our last two. The first speaker you'll hear from is Jerry Green, who is a consultant to the National Urban League, serving as its senior advisor for the 2020 census. She spearheads the National Urban League's advocacy on 2020 census issues and initiatives, and recently served as senior advisor for civic engagement at the Office of the Director of the US Census Bureau, where she engaged civil rights organizations and diverse national leaders on critical 2020 census policy and design issues. So we're delighted to have Jerry on this call. Stephanie Kim is the Director of Government and Nonprofit Programs at Community Connect Labs. Stephanie works at the nonprofit and provides census outreach technology and training, and she actually managed and developed all of the Community Connect Lab's field staff recruitment program, including the user research, testing, partner implementation, and participation in the Census Bureau's Technology Accelerator Program. Stephanie's a featured speaker, and we are really delighted to have her here today. Gavin Baker will also be joining us. He's the Assistant Director of Government Relations for the American Library Association in Washington, D.C. Gavin has been working to help libraries prepare to support a complete count in the 2020 census. He previously worked at Common Cause and the Center for Effective Government and as an enumerator in the 2010 census. So I'll let Jocelyn introduce our last two speakers.
So Felicia Hill, we're so pleased that she is able to join us. She's the Associate Counsel with the Economic Justice Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, where she focuses on challenging systemic discrimination in employment and minimizing barriers to community reintegration for African Americans and other minorities with criminal histories. She addresses collateral consequences in employment through the Records Assistance Program, which provides pro bono legal assistance to seal, expunge, or correct criminal records. We're really excited for her to be able to share her insights today. And our last speaker is our moderator for today's session, Terry Ann Lowenthal, who is an expert on all things census and is really critical to supporting so much of the work that all of us are doing, including serving as a consultant to both the Leadership Conference and the Funders Census Initiative. So with that, that's all we have for introductions. I'm going to turn it over to Terry Ann to kick off the webinar. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jocelyn. Hello, census funders and stakeholders. Nice to see you all. We have a lot of important information to share with you today, and we also want to save ample time to respond to questions. So I'm just going to make one point to set the stage for our really terrific lineup of speakers. I think our universe of happy census warriors is approaching the 2020 census on two fronts. One centers around the Get Out the Count efforts, that is convincing people that it's important and safe to participate in the census. And then the other is focused on helping the Census Bureau stand up the army of temporary census workers that is needed to help ensure a successful census. So today's webinar is focused on that second bucket, and it's especially timely because right now the Census Bureau is gearing up for the first substantial recruitment push for field operations. You will hear more about that in a minute. And then 1 year from now, the large army of temporary census takers, known as enumerators, will be in training for their star turn during non-response follow-up. The Census Bureau must fill other important positions on a steady basis from now all the way through completion of the census, and all against the backdrop of a significant challenge facing the 2020 census, and that is a low unemployment rate that makes it more difficult to attract, hire, and retain a qualified, diverse, and culturally competent workforce from start to finish. So again, we have quite the lineup of speakers today. So without further ado, I am pleased to turn the microphone over to our first presenter, Jerry Green.
Thank you so much, Terry Ann, and thank you to Beth as well for all the great work that you're doing with the Census Counts Campaign. Good afternoon to the audience out there in digital land. Thank you for the opportunity to engage you today on the 2020 census, particularly its hiring and recruitment issues. This is an important matter, right up there with internet response, the digital divide, counting children, questionnaire content, and all the other 2020 census priorities we focused on this decade. As census stakeholders, we tend to place an understandable but disproportionate amount of attention on the hiring of the 1,500 partnership specialists the Census Bureau will eventually hire for the 2020 census. As critical as they are to raising census awareness in our communities, they are only a small part of the Census Bureau's effort to obtain an accurate count from the regional field perspective. Rather, there are 500,000 temporary fellow census workers who will join them are the critical mass on which we need to focus right now. As a former Census Bureau employee who has worked on the last 3 censuses, I only left in 2017, my former colleagues and I understand that there comes a time each decade when Census Bureau researchers, census managers, and even census leadership have to brush their hands off and put the census to bed operationally. Of course, there's plenty of work still to do with the communications campaign and partnerships and national partnerships. But for all intents and purposes, there's no more tweaking, no more testing. The time comes when the decennial census is put into the hands of the regional field infrastructure. And in doing so, there's an implicit trust within the Bureau. It's really interesting to see play out. And you can't see it from the external side, but there's an implicit trust and understanding that the field workforce will make things right. They'll smooth out the rough edges, the rough spots, and get out the count. So it is a tremendous responsibility that is passed on to the regions each decade with respect and cautious optimism. From the senior managers, the census planners, the designers, the methodologists, the demographers, all those people who have been working on the census the entire decade now understand that this is the time, it's the region's time. So we must understand that the capability, the availability, and the readiness of the regional census workforce directly impacts the Census Bureau's ability to conduct an accurate count of historically undercounted and hard to count populations. It directly impacts the provision of accurate numbers to the states for apportionments and the numbers upon which federal agencies rely upon to allocate funds to our communities. Once we look at 2020 census recruitment and hiring through this lens, with this kind of gravitas, and connect the dots, we can see how important it is to have this conversation today to shed light on some of the challenges facing Census 2020 census hiring and recruitment, and what we can do about it. If you would advance to the next slide, please, Beth. I don't see it. Okay, I know we are going to be patient. Yes. So, the census is indeed a national undertaking. It's mandated by the Constitution. The US Congress has oversight and approved census funding. And even the President of the United States gets involved and plays a role in its development. You can't get any more national than that. However, the census is locally implemented. Certainly not under the jurisdiction of local governments. Let's be very clear about this. This is not a local elected governmental process, but rather its success depends on the Census Bureau's ability to successfully recruit, hire, and train temporary workers who live in and are knowledgeable about their local communities. For the 2020 census, for the record, the Bureau will open 248 area census offices from which the census will be conducted. Last census in 2010, there were twice as many. Back then, they were called local census offices. Actually, there were 494 that were responsible for the enumeration effort. So we're going to have to see how that's going to play out. But it's worrisome, to say the least. Most ACOs, or area census offices, are open for approximately 16 months from late summer 2019 until December 2020. In total, the Census Bureau anticipates hiring 500,000 temporary census workers to conduct the census. However, please know that it will need to recruit 5 times that amount, 2.5 million applicants, to ensure that it has a sufficient hiring pool that meets its hiring goals. Next slide, please. Okay, so I put this slide in to show you the complexity of operations the Census Bureau needs to staff up on to perform, the count in the regions. Many people believe that non-response follow-up is the only temporary census operation out there that matters. But remember, the census has special enumeration procedures for almost every type of living accommodation that respondents reside within, even counting people who travel with circuses or work as seasonal farm workers in the migrant work stream. I sometimes remind people that the Census Bureau counts everyone from Park Avenue to the park bench. It is an enormous task. Next slide, please. Okay, very briefly, these are the 2020 census job requirements a person has to fulfill in order to be hired as a temporary census worker. I recall in previous censuses that having access to a vehicle or having to have a vehicle was an obstacle to many applicants, especially in poor and rural locations. Now, the need to have a computer or access to a computer with internet capabilities and an email address could be a deterrent to potential applicants caught in the digital divide. So just think about that for a moment. Felicia Hill is going to do a deeper dive into background checks and job opportunities for formerly incarcerated persons. So we'll move to the next slide. Please note in that slide that being a US citizen is still considered a requirement for the census, to work as a census enumerator. We'll get to that later as well. Next slide. Okay, this is a lot of verbiage. I'm not going to read it, I promise you. It's just basically just saying, these are quotes from a 2007 General Accounting Office report that recommended improvements to the Bureau's 2010 census recruitment and hiring strategy. The bottom line is in 2010, there were similar challenges. There was a tight economy with low unemployment, and there was the introduction of a new technology, in this case, handhelds, which never saw the light of day, really. It was a huge fiasco, but nonetheless, that was a new technology of concern in 2010. And I'm just saying that to say that there were similar challenges in the previous census. And again, the field staff was expected to make lemonade out of lemons and get the count out no matter what mistakes were made external to their processes. And in 2010, they did just that. Next slide, please. And you're going to get these slides so you can read every word, all of that. Next slide, please. Okay, so, I like this slide. I like the title of it because the late great singer Dinah Washington recorded a song entitled "What a Difference a Day Makes, 24 Little Hours." So I said, I'm going to name this slide "What a Difference a Decade Makes." This slide reflects on the 2020 census and the recruitment and hiring approach it took to increase its chances of having enough workers to conduct the census. They were pretty creative back then, but I just want to bring your attention to the last two points, which show and are indicative of the Census Bureau's efforts to hire legal permanent residents or non-residents with a visa and a bilingual skill to work in the 2010 census. And similarly, they achieved or requested and obtained hiring waivers to ensure that individuals receiving federal public assistance from Medicaid or food stamps or TANF would not be penalized or lose benefits based on their temporary income from the census. These waivers really do help in the enumeration of hard-to-count populations due to hiring workers who live in these communities that have large populations of residents who are the recipients of federal public assistance. Next slide, please. Okay, there is no non-citizen hiring ban. That's the word we got from the Census Bureau. This is the PIO statement saying that the Bureau does not have a non-citizen hiring ban. And I just want to let you know that, in fact, I believe it's OPM already allows the hiring of non-citizens for certain federal positions under certain circumstances, like for translations or cultural competency. And I think especially in agencies like the State Department and Department of Defense. So the 2020 census would not be precedent setting. The Bureau's official position says, quote unquote, that it continues to work with the Office of Personnel Management to, quote, determine a path forward in being able to hire, I'm reading this, to hire legal permanent residents with necessary language skills if there are no qualified bilingual citizens within the Bureau's applicant pool in specific hard-to-count areas. That's a mouthful, end quote. Take out the mouthful part. But that's their quote, and that's their line, and they're sticking with it. Next slide. Okay, so there's a lot of words in there too, but I have great news. You'll get this slide. I was unable to find official OPM guidance on whether the Census Bureau had received a waiver to hire federal retirees without them being penalized, which would be a dollar-for-dollar offset from their annuity based on their census income. But last night, I received word from Census that it has received a waiver from OPM that permits the Census Bureau to re-employ federal retirees and not have the new additional census income affect their retirement annuity. So this is an update to this slide, and this is great news. Next slide, please. So here, last fall, September of 2018, the Office of Management and Budget sent a memo to departments and agencies that basically said, shouldn't say basically, but that pretty much put them on notice, asking them to support the census, especially those federal agencies that provide some form of public assistance to residents of the United States. So that was a helpful email, and I'm pleased to share with you that as of March 29th, there are 24 states that have opted in for Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, SNAP waivers. So there's still half of the states the Bureau still needs to obtain their approval to relieve their beneficiaries from these, so that the income would not go towards be deducted from their benefits. The United States Department of Agriculture will continue to track the states that are opting in to support the 2020 census as it relates to SNAP. For TANF, Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, the Census Bureau has received a waiver approval at the federal level and is now working with Census regional staff to follow up with individual states for approval. So this is kind of laborious. The regional offices have to go in and ask the states if they would like to opt in. So we need to keep track of which states are not opting in to provide that type of relief for their eligible beneficiaries. So we can skip the next slide. We've already talked about our OMB guidance to federal agencies. That's a list. If you go back for 1 second to that slide, this is a list of federal agencies that OMB recognizes as having a 2020 census connect with respect to hiring waivers. So they've already outlined what agencies need to be in collaboration with the census to ensure an accurate count. And you have this slide, and feel free to look at it. If you go to the next slide, please. Okay, I'm wrapping up. In conclusion, Census has received waivers from federal agencies that provide public assistance. That's a good thing. That process is evolving. On the other hand, hiring non-citizens appears to be a lightning rod issue for this administration that it is in no hurry to resolve. So we must continue to monitor and wait and see the outcome of this issue and be prepared. Continue to plan and prepare. We also now have clarity regarding the Bureau's position on seeking Social Security waivers, which I will share, and for hiring retired federal annuitants. The Census Bureau did not pursue Social Security waivers in 2010, nor will it do so in 2020. Census staff believe that the majority of the field positions would not be a disincentive to Social Security recipients ages 62 to 65 unless the individual had multiple jobs that put them over the Social Security threshold. And once you turn the right young age of 65, as a Social Security recipient, you can work, hit the lotto, or whatever you want to do. It won't go towards, you won't be penalized for any additional income. In conclusion, I think it's fair to say that regions, and I've gone out and had events at regions, have a different on-the-ground reality associated with recruitment and hiring. The regions are frustrated with the minimum 3 to 6 month wait period they face to get background checks and other sign-offs to hire temporary staff, among other hiring challenges. However, at Census headquarters, we continue to hear about the ease of the Census job application process and a huge number of employees who have applied online. Mind you, that's a number that has applied. We don't know. I'm sure there's a number for who's been hired, but the impact is still being felt at the regional level. So in closing, as I said in the beginning of my presentation, census hiring is a most important link and key to an accurate count, fair representation, and federal funding to our communities. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Great. Thank you so much, Jerry, for that great context, for how the census unfolds region by census region and community by community. And thanks for the breaking news about the offset waiver for federal annuitants who can take temporary census job without losing part of their monthly retirement benefits. So our next speaker, again, is Stephanie Kim with Community Connect Labs, who will talk more about recruitment, specifically about recruitment for field staff, the online application process, and then tools to help stakeholders facilitate applications for job seekers. Stephanie?
All right, thank you, Terry Ann. Thanks everyone for joining us this morning or afternoon. For those of you back east, we are really excited to talk about the actual physical application. So, we're going along with all the differences between the 2010 and the 2020 census. One of the big differences also, in addition to the census itself moving online, is that the field job application has also moved online. So my goal for this conversation is to show you what that looks like. And then as we imagine who are the ideal candidates who could really do well in this role, what can we do on the ground to really ensure that the online application is something that they could successfully go through? So if you go on to the next slide, please. Great. So yeah, as a little background and reminder, so my organization, Community Connect Labs, we are a nonprofit technology provider. We provide technology and training for census outreach efforts. And so everything that I'm sharing with you is based on our work. We are really lucky to be in communication with the Census Bureau, and we're able to participate in the Census Bureau's accelerator program, the Opportunity Project, and worked with field staff and operations leadership to really explore the situation ahead and how we could support efforts on the ground. So as I mentioned, the application has moved online, and the actual tool that field staff will be using is also going to be a technology tool. They'll be using an app in the field. So again, thinking about who has traditionally worked as an enumerator in the past and who we might need to do outreach to support for this time around. Let's keep that in mind as we're looking through these next slides. So next slide, please. Great. So this is the online application homepage. This is currently live. So if you go to 2020census.gov/jobs, this, to reiterate what Terry Ann was saying, is for temporary positions, most of which are field staff. So if you're thinking about address listers, which are being hired this year, and then enumerators, who is going to be the vast majority of the hiring goal, which is starting this fall. There will be some clerical positions and other office positions that are also temporary that are hired through this website. And the census has designed one centralized application portal for everyone to submit their information into, and then they'll be contacted as the hiring happens. For other census jobs that are, in the federal offices, for instance, or in the regional offices, those are at usajobs.gov. Sorry, usajobs.gov. It's a different website, it's a different process, and it's a different pay. So if you look on this website, 2020census.gov/jobs, you can look up the pay rate in your region. And this is, again, pertaining to the temporary work, most of which is field jobs. So this application was opened last September. So I submitted my application as soon as it came out, and that's how I'm able to show you these screenshots here. But it's interesting to note that this was not used during the end-to-end test in Rhode Island, for instance. So we interviewed some enumerators who worked in Rhode Island last summer, and they applied using a paper form. So, all of this is to show that this is something that is still being worked out as they're moving forward in the timeline, but it is indeed live. And the best way really for all of you to get to know the process is to just go in and go through the application yourself. It takes about half an hour. So as you experience it, you'll be able to see what your job seeker candidates might be experiencing as well. So this first page is a screenshot of the first step that is taken. If you click on new applicant, you have to create a profile. So you could see that, you have to put in your personal information. You need to have an email address. The census is going to be using email to communicate with candidates about their status and on updates for their application. So again, thinking about those candidates who might be a good fit for this, do they have active email addresses? Do they, check their email regularly? If this is a barrier that you foresee, then maybe as we think about programs on the ground, how do you support people through that? I created a snapshot of the password suggestions because that is a really complicated alphanumeric password that you have to put in. But again, this is the first step that everyone needs to take. If you go to the next slide, please. So once you create your profile, then you will actually get an email confirmation. So this is a screenshot of what I got in my inbox, and it provides next steps on what to do to create your profile and to actually start getting going on the application. So you can move on to the next slide. And this next slide is a screenshot of the first page of the application. Oh, we might have lost my slides. Let's see for a second. Well, I'll try and keep talking through without the screenshots for the sake of time. The application is a couple of pages that you'll click through. It's the kind where, you know, it like has different sections, and then there's a little save and exit or a save and next button on the bottom right. The application itself is only available in English, so you have to submit it in English everywhere in the US except for in Puerto Rico, because in Puerto Rico they want the enumerator to be fluent in Spanish. The assessment, which comes after the application, will then be available in English and Spanish. If you take the assessment in Spanish, then that will also, you will also need to take an English proficiency assessment. So the first page of the application is the profile page. The first thing they ask you right off the bat is your social security number. So they're putting in that information. You're putting in, you know, like your address. They ask you for your nearest cross streets because they're going to take your address and draw a little radius around it. And then anywhere that needs to be enumerated in that radius, if you fall into that block and you happen to have the availability, you scored well on the assessment, they'll turn the algorithm and they pull your name. So they do really want people to reflect the neighborhood that they're counting and to be familiar with the neighborhood they're counting, which is why that address is important. Thinking about people, you know, I was interviewing job seekers from an organization where a lot of the folks they serve are people experiencing homelessness, and they actually use the organization as the main address for that they put on all official forms. So thinking through again the challenges of and the implications of that will be something that we'll need to do. You could go to slide 6. So it's the one after this. Well, thank you. Oh, sorry, the one right before this. I do want to show you slide 6. There we go. So you'll see, I did not see this on my application because I am an applicant who identifies as female, but for male applicants, because you are required to be registered for selective service, it does ask you for your selective service number. Now, this is something where, you know, I don't know about you, but I polled all informally my male colleagues and my male friends, and they were like, I don't know that number off the back of my head. So they have to go in and have that prepared. And again, if you're thinking about the applicants who maybe they don't have a computer at home and they're going to the library to apply, and then they find out that they need this number. Granted, they could go online and look for it, but you know, what can we do to provide them this information up front so that they're not caught in the middle of the application saying, oh geez, I wasn't prepared for this. Next slide, please. So the next few pages of the application are to see if you qualify for any waivers or if there are any you know, potential issues with your candidacy. So since the jobs do provide veterans preference, they ask you if you have a history with military service, and they ask you to provide documentation there. They also asked in another page that I do not show here, if you are an existing federal employee or if you have worked for the federal government in the past. So you can see it's a lot of, you know, clicking yes, no, and then filling out fields. Next slide, please. All right, language skills and availability. So again, while the application is only available in English and the assessment is in English and Spanish, they really want to recruit a strong pipeline of diverse candidates who could speak multiple languages. And if they have neighborhoods that need to be enumerated, that are, you know, that have certain languages that are spoken, when they're running their algorithm of who to pull for that job, they're going to be looking at the language skills. So they're asking here, there is no fluency test, there is no assessment for any of the languages that you indicate. So it might be good also to message to the candidates that you might potentially be working with that, you know, if you took high school Spanish, that might not make you fluent. And, you know, if you say that you're fluent here, then you might be sent to enumerated Spanish speaking neighborhood. So really be careful and cognizant about that. If you go to the next slide, please. The availability page, when we put this application in front of some job seekers during the user interviews, this one actually created the most confusion amongst them. So it asked you for the transportation access that you have, since while they will, you know, draw that radius around you and send you to enumerate in those areas, that radius looks different depending on if you're in, you know, New York City or if you're in Idaho somewhere. So the access here could be a little unclear. What we've clarified is that you got to have access to that vehicle. For instance, if you plan on using a shared ride service like Uber or Lyft to get around, it's not like you'll be reimbursed for that transit. So do not say that you have access to that vehicle. The other piece of information at the bottom that they ask for is your availability. So since they want enumerators to go and knock on doors, obviously when people are home, so that they could actually speak with them and take their census response, they're looking for people who could work evenings and weekends. And the great thing about this job is that these field jobs are all really flexible. It's sort of similar to the other types of gig economy jobs where you set your own schedule. So the way that they did it in the Rhode Island test was that people set their schedule the night before. They indicated in their little app. We interviewed a community college student, and she said that she had a final the next day. So she said she was only available between 4 and 6 p.m. And then if there was some assignment that fell in during that time, then that morning her app would ping her, and then she would go out and accept the assignment. So it asks you for when you're able to work and roughly how many hours you're available to work per week. This one's a little difficult because the job is so far out, and a lot of people, especially the candidates that we think might be great for this position, are not really able to project what their availability could be. Next slide, please. And I'm cognizant of the time. We have so much great content to go through really quickly. So that was the online application. Once you finish that, that's your profile. It's all set. The assessment is a 33-question assessment that you need to take in one sitting. It's timed about 15 minutes. And as you see here, these are the types of questions that are available, that are going to be presented. So they were, as you could see, it's not like math questions or reading comprehension questions, which might have been on earlier assessments in previous censuses. This one is sort of like a what would you do situation. So again, thinking about the candidates that you are trying to encourage to apply for this type of role, some of these questions don't translate well culturally, for instance. So just keep that in mind. I want to end it. Let's go to the last two slides here, and then I'll pass it on to our next presenters because I want to make sure there's enough time. Once you finish the application, this is the email that I got in my inbox, and then you go to the next slide. The portal that you created your application in becomes sort of your dashboard. So I just want to show that dashboard slide before we move forward. And that dashboard is where people can log in and see the status of their application. Again, their email will be pinged also if they are called to move on to the next step. If a person is called and hired, then they also have to fill out some onboarding forms and then also register for the background check. All of that takes place through this process, through this portal. So you'll get the rest of the slides after the webinar. If you look towards the later portions, we have mapped out there some timelines, some dates for you to look out to for the different types of recruitment that's happening, and also some of the solutions that my organization has been putting together to support this process. So thank you very much for your time.
Oh, great. Thank you so much for that valuable information, Stephanie. We do need to move on. I do want to note that you advised our audience that the application process takes about 30 minutes. That is longer, folks, than the Census Bureau is saying, not surprisingly, but that primarily tells me that assisting people with the application process will be essential. And fortunately, our next speaker, Gavin Baker with the American Library Association, will provide an overview of how community organizations can engage in efforts to support the hiring process. Gavin?
Thank you, Terry Ann, and thank you, Beth and Jocelyn, for having me, and to all the attendees for being here today. As Terry Ann mentioned, my name is Gavin Baker, and I'm at the American Library Association. We have the first slide, please. As you might know, libraries in your community may offer many resources that could be useful in your census outreach efforts. If you haven't seen it yet, I encourage you to check out our brief, Libraries and the 2020 Census. You can find it at the web address on the slide. If you're involved with a complete count committee or a similar effort in your area, I hope you'll consider inviting your local library to participate, and you can find other ideas for collaboration in the guide. Could I have the next slide, please? Today, of course, we're focused on hiring for the 2020 census, so I'll talk a bit about how libraries have been helping people to apply for census jobs and what organizations like yours can do. First of all, as you've heard, the application for 2020 census jobs is online. If someone wants to apply for a job and doesn't have a computer or internet access at home, they can check with their local library or employment center to find out how to get online there. Next slide, please. As the previous slide mentioned, it is important to know that the online application is secure. Here's how you can tell by checking the web address. the S, and well, my arrows didn't end up exactly. That's funny. Just imagine that those arrows are pointing at the things that I'm talking about. The S in the web address there stands for secure, which means that any information entered on the website is encrypted. And many web browsers also show a lock icon next to the address on websites that are secure. To have the next slide, please. And for many people who need to get online to complete a job application, their local library may be the most convenient free source of internet access. And for organizations on the call today, you might be familiar with the website on this slide, which has information about hard to count census areas. But you might know that that website also has information about the locations of public libraries. There's a toggle button in the bottom right. That arrow is closer, but still didn't quite point to the right thing. But anyhow, toggle button in the bottom right will show the library locations on the map. So this website might be useful for your organization to locate public libraries that may have resources for job applicants. Of course, you'll want to check with the individual library to find out its hours and what services it offers. In addition to the availability of computers, they may have other services for job seekers, such as resume review or career coaching. Next slide, please. And here are a few ideas about how to let your community members know about these opportunities. You could include information about census job opportunities in your newsletter, on your social media like Facebook or Twitter, or on your blog, through your job board if you have one, or you could even invite the Census Bureau to host a job fair at your organization or promote a job fair that's happening in your community. There may already be one planned at your local library. If you're interested in doing any of these things in your community, you'll want to get in touch with your local Census Bureau office. You'll want to call the toll-free number on the screen. That's 1-855-JOB-2020, and choose option 3 to connect to your local office. There's also a lot of information available on the 2020 Census website. For instance, the Census Bureau's YouTube channel has a series of videos specifically about 2020 job opportunities in English as well as Spanish, which could be great resources for your organizations to share. And I'll close with a few examples of activities we've seen in libraries around the country to support census hiring. Can I have the next slide, please? And the first one is from Connecticut, where the New Haven Public Library has hosted 5 census job fairs, which reached 160 people. Next slide, please. In New York, career coaches at the New York Public Library have helped people apply for census jobs. Next slide, please. And here's a job fair in a very different type of community in Clinton, Iowa. I think the photo really conveys the type of community that you're talking about here, and speaks to Jerry's point and what Terry-Ann has mentioned as well about how the census happens in every local community, and it looks a little bit different in each of them. And next slide, please. Finally, here is a census hiring event at a library in Delaware. And could I have the last slide? So for more information about how libraries can help with census hiring and other activities, again, check out our brief at the address on the screen. If you're tweeting about us, our hashtag is #CountOnLibraries, and our Twitter handle is @ALA Library. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Gavin. And our final speaker is Felicia Hill with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Before I just tell you in one sentence what Felicia is going to focus on, I do want to let everyone know that if you're able to stay with us for a few minutes after 2 p.m., we will go over a few minutes to try and address the questions that have come in. We got a little bit of a late start because of what I call little computer boogeymen, otherwise known as tech issues. Felicia will discuss fair chance hiring for 2020 census positions, which came about as a result of litigation filed during the 2010 census. Felicia?
Thank you, Terry. So I will try to keep my presentation brief, and I'm actually going to skip over a few slides that are in it because you will get those slides and be able to review them on your own. If we can go to the next slide, thank you. So in 2010, the Lawyers Committee and a few other civil rights organizations, including Latino Justice, the Center for Constitutional Rights, the Community Service Society of New York, and Community Legal Services of Philadelphia, along with Outen and Golden, filed a lawsuit on behalf of African Americans and Latinx community members who had applied for jobs as enumerators in the 2010 census, but were rejected as a result of the Bureau's then discriminatory criminal history background check. I'm going to get into a little bit later on sort of what that process looked like and how it's different now. But it's just important to know that that lawsuit challenged the way that the Census Bureau conducted their hiring and implemented and brought about a lot of changes that will be implemented for the 2020 census. I can have the next slide. So we, I think, are aware that there are a lot of racial disparities in the United States criminal system, and African Americans, Latinx Americans, and Native Americans are far more likely to have arrest records and convictions than their white counterparts, which then in turn means that they will face greater collateral consequences upon reentry. And we see that sort of in this very specific context in the way in which people were denied access to employment in 2010. So I'm actually going to skip over the next 2-3 slides because it's just a lot of statistics about collateral consequences and barriers to reentry. And I really encourage everybody who's participating on the call to take a moment to take a look at those statistics and to just think about the ways that even within your own individual communities, you're seeing these statistics sort of be carried out in other employment settings, but particularly as it relates to the census hiring. So while we're skipping through the slide, I'm going to go ahead and keep going. So in 2010, the way that the process worked is that they were attempting to fill 2 types of positions. Ones that we've already talked about, these ones where people come into direct contact with the public, enumerators or crew leaders or recruiting assistants. But then there were also positions that were office positions where people didn't have any actual interaction with the public. But despite the differences in these types of positions, there at the time was no difference in the way that the criminal background check was used. At the time, the census was not applying any standards to analyze the criminal history of the applicants. And so that amounted to there simply just being a blanket ban on anybody who had any sort of criminal conviction or even a criminal contact. So even an arrest was enough to prevent somebody from having access to a job. Next slide. So in 2010, what would happen is that the census would send out what was called a 30-day letter. Those 30-day letters were requesting that the applicant submit to the census an official record of any and all of their arrests and convictions. But the issue with this was that for many of the applicants, their convictions were either very, very old, and so it was difficult to obtain the documentation required to satisfy the census request, or some of these records did not even exist anymore because the record was supposed to have been expunged or sealed or destroyed. Next slide. So as a result of the census litigation, there were sort of 2 options offered to the affected class members. One was the assistance of correcting the mistakes on their criminal history through the assistance of pro bono services, and that is what I here at the Lawyers Committee manage. It's called our Records Assistance Project, and we supervise connecting the affected class members with pro bono services in order to clear up their records. The other sort of relief was an advance notice about the 2020 census hiring so that people would have enough time to still obtain some of these records, kind of get a running head start, if you will. It also required that the census was to retain 2 industrial organizational psychologists to help develop and validate new procedures for the temporary hiring of field employees. And so that's what I'm going to talk about quickly next. So now in the 2020 census, there will actually be fewer, it should be noted that they will likely be hiring fewer workers, but there is also a lower unemployment rate currently, so we anticipate that this is going to make recruiting a lot more difficult to do. But that doesn't stop the fact that they will still need a very large and diverse workforce in order to maximize the participation of the census, and we're all aware of all the reasons why high participation is critical. However, these jobs really are good jobs, and so it's important to ensure that people in communities of color, people in underrepresented communities are encouraged to apply even if they may have a criminal history. And this is really sort of the first hiring cycle to happen after this critical landmark settlement, and so it's important to sort of see what this is going to look like and how we're going to be able to implement these changes in a meaningful way. Next slide. So I think the important thing to note for the 2020 census is that there is no longer a blanket ban on people with criminal contacts, so people either with an arrest or with a criminal conviction. And so now the Census Bureau is considering a number of other relevant factors. So they're not only considering whether or not there's a criminal contact, but they're also looking at the relationship between the criminal contact or conviction and the job that the enumerators or the people coming into contact with communities are going to be asked to do. Also really important is the consideration of how recently the contact is and if there's been any evidence of rehabilitation. One of the plaintiffs in our case was denied employment in the 2010 census as an enumerator, but had previously worked in the 2000 census as an enumerator with the same exact criminal history. And so, it's really important now for those factors to be considered. And again, we're encouraging people to apply because there really is no way to know with any amount of certainty if you'll be eligible until you've applied for that position. So now what is happening, what is different from the 2010 census, is that in 2010, the way that the background check was conducted was that it was done by just a simple name check. So the census would enter the person's name, potentially their date of birth, and they would run an FBI background check. The results of that check were inaccurate. So now the way that background checks are being conducted is actually through a fingerprint check, and that is supposed to be more accurate. It's going to use the fingerprint cards that are actually in the FBI database to run people's background checks. That will do a couple of things for people who are applying for jobs. One, it will hopefully bring up more accurate representations of people's criminal histories. The other thing is that now that this is a fingerprint check, the Census Bureau will be able to provide more meaningful information to applicants about what is on their background check and actually give people an opportunity to provide any supporting documentation about rehabilitation, or to be able to say, that was expunged from my record, and be able to provide, hopefully be able to provide some court documentation. And now, if there is any negative information that is on the background check or inaccurate information, then applicants have to be given an opportunity to actually correct those inaccuracies while remaining a part of the applicant pool. And so we also are noting that the Census Bureau, and this is my last slide, we're noting that the Census Bureau has dedicated more of their resources to ensuring that there is actually a valid process in place, and that there's more staff in place to process these applications and to review background checks and to respond to any inquiries. Another thing to note is that because this is now conducted via fingerprint and not via name, that the census employees, while people are following up about the status of their applications, are actually able to give more detailed information to people following up. And hopefully, given the fact that this is now a digitized process and people are required to provide an email address and a lot of the communication will be done digitally, that these issues will be able to be resolved a lot more quickly for people who are seeking these jobs. And so we want people on the ground in communities to encourage people with criminal histories to apply for these census jobs, especially now because the blanket ban is lifted, but also because there's now an opportunity to really advocate for to really advocate for yourself in pointing out ways that you have been rehabilitated, and pointing out other opportunities that have been granted even though you might have a criminal conviction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Felicia. So everyone, funders, stakeholders, census warriors, it is about 2 o'clock. We are going to try to stick with this for a few questions for 5 to 10 minutes. If you can't stay with us, please know that we will capture all of your questions and answer those and make the answers available in the near future. While I'm finishing up, just a reminder to my speakers, please turn your webcams on again and take yourself off mute. We can only take written questions today, audience. So to submit, again, a reminder to submit a question, click the arrow next to questions on your control panel. That will open up a chat box. And then we will answer as many questions as we can right now. And let me start with some that have come in already. Jerry, just can you clarify the agency that is providing the waivers, if you will, for allowing people to work and not have their wages count against eligibility for other programs? Which agency, is it federal or in some cases state, that are providing those waivers? Jerry, you're on mute.
I'm sorry about that. The federal government gives the agency authority to, at the departmental level, to partner with the Census Bureau. And it appears that for some of these, the Census Bureau has to contact their state departments of agriculture or, to obtain those waivers on a state-by-state basis. That's what it appears what I'm getting back from the Census Bureau on some of these programs. As it relates to OPM and federal retirement annuitants, that seems to be a much easier and simpler process where the Office of Personnel Management gives a blanket authority. But it seems that if any of the folks on this panel have any additional information to help clarify, for instance, with the US Department of Agriculture, with respect to SNAP and issues, the food stamp waiver, please let me know. But it appears that the Census Bureau is following up with each state.
Great. So there's going to have to be some work done by advocates, folks in our audience, with your, through your state agencies that are administering some of these programs like Medicaid and SNAP and TANF and the like. Those are really administered at the state level. So thank you. I'm going to ask Felicia, Gavin, Stephanie to try to turn on their webcams while we move to the next question. This is a really important one, but let's try to answer it quickly. Let's just confirm the application is only online, so there's no paper or hard copy offered. Stephanie, is that correct?
For the vast majority, it will be available online. If there are some accessibility issues, there will be special cases where paper form can be provided, but as far as my understanding goes, it's not going to be something that you could just request to do.
Thank you. And I'm just going to follow up quickly. So what Stephanie said is my understanding as well. There, may be folks in either rural areas or there may be accessibility issues that really can't do this online. So the Census Bureau, I would say that you should have applicants contact when they are open your area census offices. Those, by the way, will be posted on the CUNY Hard to Count digital map, or even contact the regional office to try to facilitate an in-person or a paper application. So I hope that helps. Let me move on. We've already talked about background checks, so we can skip over that. There are a lot of questions about this fuzziness around whether the Census Bureau will hire work-eligible non-citizens, legal permanent residents, but work-eligible for temporary census jobs. Somebody noted that they've had somebody applying for jobs go online, but if you check off that you're a non-citizen, you automatically are disqualified, right? And you can't proceed. So Jerry, or really anyone, if you want to elaborate just quickly on what we know so far about whether the Census Bureau will allow limited hiring of non-work eligible non-citizens. Jerry or Stephanie, if you want to start there.
I actually tried I called the Los Angeles regional office in preparing for this presentation to see, given that it's one of the most diverse regions, regional census centers out there, and was asked if I were, if I was a non-citizen but with legal status, could I apply for a job? And they promptly told me no. So I did try that at the regional level. I'm not hearing anything different than that perspective at the national level, at headquarters or otherwise.
Thank you. Stephanie, did you have anything you wanted to add? If not, I'm going to take 60 seconds and address that because this is so crucial.
Sure, Terry Ann, you could go ahead on this.
Thanks. So here's the bottom line, folks. There is a law now that prohibits the hiring, general hiring for federal positions across the board of non-citizens. But that provision of law has some exceptions. And one of the exceptions has to do with being able to hire not work eligible non-citizens for specific jobs that require language skills or cultural sensitivity. Those last words are mine. I'm paraphrasing. The Census Bureau isn't there yet in terms of getting, frankly, the administration, whether it's OPM, the Commerce Department, or OMB, to sign off on letting the Census Bureau do this as it did, as you heard, for the last couple of censuses. So yes, we're kind of in limbo right now about whether the Census Bureau will be able to take advantage of that exception. It clearly wants to, but it's just not there yet. And so we will continue to press for that on the advocacy front, and we will keep everybody posted. Beth and Jocelyn, do we have time for a few more questions, a couple more questions?
I think we have a little bit more time, and thank you to the vast majority of you who stayed on beyond the 2 o'clock time. So, Terry Ann, if you, our fearless leader, are okay with hanging on for a little bit longer, I think we can absolutely take some more questions.
Let's try a couple. Thank you so much, Beth. I see somebody asked about how advocates, nonprofits at the local level can help men find their selective service number prior to starting the process. Does anybody want to weigh in on that? Gavin, anyone? Gavin, you would have a selective service number, frankly. So do you have any advice?
I've got it in a box. I think, as Stephanie noted, perhaps the most useful thing, unless there's a way to look it up, is just to let people know in advance that this is something that they're going to need, and they might want to identify it in their files. But Stephanie looks like she might know about a lookup tool.
Go ahead, Stephanie.
Sure. This is from just what I hear from my male friends. But if you do, when on the slide where, on the application page where it asks for your selective service number, there is a link that takes you to a government website, which allows you to look it up. I haven't gone through that myself, but I do believe that is a feature that is there. The other thing I would suggest is that a lot of the organizations that might be the best equipped to help job candidates are ones that are already helping people find their selective service numbers. And so if you're talking to like workforce boards, job training nonprofits, those sorts of organizations, they usually have the infrastructure already in place and staff already trained to help people do that.
Great, that is great information. And let me just say, folks, I said this when we were doing a prep call earlier this week for this webinar. I see a great fact sheet on census hiring and the application process in our future, our near future. So all these questions are really great, and we will make sure that they are addressed in a very concise fact sheet that covers a lot of the basic information you heard today, as well as the answers to some of these great questions. I see that somebody's asked about how many applications the Census Bureau has received so far, and is there any way to track that? Jerry, do you have any more information about that? Although I think the answer to tracking that is a little dicier, but go ahead.
I did see a number. I'm hesitant to give it. I saw something in the 20,000 range.
There's more than that right now.
Yeah, it's up in the couple of 100,000s, I think, of applicants. It doesn't mean they're all qualified, but I think that's what we... Thousands? Yeah.
Really? Okay, well, take it
away.
The
last number I saw, sorry to interrupt, Jerry, that's the whole thing. So the last number I saw was around 140,000. Right now, since they're recruiting mostly for address listers, and it's the same applicant pool that is for address listers, clerical staff, and enumerators, you know, each regional office would be the best to inform you what percentage of their hiring or applicant pool they're at. So for instance, we were talking to folks in the Los Angeles region, for instance, and they said that they already got 200% of their needed applicants for address listers, but we don't know what the actual recruitment number is for address listers, if it's 20, if it's 200, and that could vary for another region where they might be at 50% of their hiring target, but they need, you know, fewer or more. Yeah, so they feel good about where they are with their recruitment progress, but my personal take is that we are still a year out from these jobs, and a lot happens between now and then. So really emphasizing filling that pipeline, and not only that, but engaging that pipeline over the next year will be crucial to making sure that the applicants actually turn over to hires.
Yeah, that's a really important point, folks. Oh, go ahead.
No, that number makes sense because address canvassing is the next huge operation. So thank you. Yes.
Yes, that's very helpful. Thank you. And again, the pipeline that Stephanie just talked about is really important, because the problem is people are applying now, but the jobs for which they're qualified may not be available for months and months and months and months. So people might give up, or they might find another job. And this is going to be a real challenge to stay in touch with folks who have applied for jobs. I do see a question about the update leave operation. Jerry, if you don't mind, I'm just going to jump in here. Of course, we did cover that during the self-response webinar, but the update leave operation, folks, just a reminder, is when census takers in select rural areas and all remote areas will go out and hand deliver the census materials as they update the master address file and the digital maps. Those jobs will be similar to the enumerator jobs, even though they're not actually enumerating. So those will come from that larger applicant pool for the enumerator workforce, yes. On American Indian reservations, I know the Census Bureau very much wants to try and hire enumerators and update leave workers who are from the tribes, frankly, and are culturally sensitive and familiar with those areas. So I think those are the questions that I have so far. Beth, I think, again, if there are other ones, folks, that are in writing, we will make sure that we answer all these in writing again and make that available to everyone. Thank you for those great questions. And I do want to turn it back over to Beth and Jocelyn for some quick closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Terry Ann. And Terry Ann, thank you again for being our expert moderator here. And really keeping us moving. Thank you so much to all of our speakers for sharing your wisdom and expertise with this group and staying on after the allotted time to really answer everybody's questions. We are so, so grateful. And so from myself and from Jocelyn, thank you for your time and your expertise and for sharing that with this group. I do just want to remind everybody on the line that this is the second of our 6-part Census Operations webinar series, and we invite folks to prepare and schedule, block off your time in May, on May 8th, to join us for our next webinar in the series. It'll be at 1 o'clock on that day, talking about group quarters and not enumeration Operations. So we're really excited for that presentation. We'll be joined by Kara Brumfeld from the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality, Megan Maury from the National LGBTQ Task Force, again, Terry Ann Lowenthal, expert census consultant, and it'll be moderated by Christiane Arana from the Latino Community Foundation. So we really welcome folks to and invite folks to RSVP for that. You can RSVP at censuscounts.org or at the Funders Census Initiative website as well. So please join and sign up for that webinar. Thank you again to our speakers. Thank you to our attendees. Folks may now disconnect.
Thanks.